Thank you all. It's lovely to see you, lovely to welcome you to the third in this evening keynote panel in the 50th anniversary celebration of the School of Communication. My name's Stuart Points, and I'm the director of the school, and it's really lovely to have you here. There's a ton going on in the city tonight. This is a very intense time in many people's lives, and I want to acknowledge that and recognize that. We have a very special panel that we'll say much more about. Let me begin by offering a land acknowledgement. I want to share that some of you who have been to previous 50th anniversary celebrations will know that Martin Guerin, Musqueam elder, has offered a beautiful opening to our sessions, and unfortunately he let us know that this afternoon that that things had happened and that made it impossible to be here tonight, and wanted to send deep apologies for that. And we wanted to thank him because his openings have been signature to our start to these events. So I want to remind us of those experiences and acknowledge that our evening and people associated with Simon Fraser University and our work together respectfully and with gratitude work on the shared traditional Coast Salish lands of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Coquitlam nations in Vancouver and Burnaby. And because our event is being brought in part, as I'll explain in a moment, through Zoom, it's important to acknowledge that our servers operate in Surrey. And so I'll continue and say we acknowledge the Kaitsi, I apologize, my glasses, the Kaitsi, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Kakite, Musqueam, and numerous Stolo nations, including the Semiahmoo and Tsawwassen in Surrey. We acknowledge the sovereignty and equality of Indigenous nations and are guided by aspirations to remake Canada into a decolonial state. I thank you again for coming and want to acknowledge that today we are joined by three remarkable Indigenous artists, scholars, leaders. We welcome and are excited by the event that's going to unfold. I also want to bring in now our fourth member of our panel, who unfortunately yesterday came down with COVID and is joining us. We are very grateful, from Montreal. I'm going to just very quickly throw Fenwick up onto the screen in this way and say, hello, Fenwick. It's great to have you from Montreal. And people wave to you. Thank you. As part of our 50th anniversary celebration, we have aimed to bring together a series of programs around communication as critique, because that practice of critique and critical consciousness, the work of critique, is central to our school today, to our past, and to our future. And as we bring together our third event in this panel, we are grateful for those who have joined us. I want to share just a bit of an opening as a way of setting our event, and then pass things over to Dr. Carmen Cray, who will be our moderator and guide for the panel and for the discussion to follow. Carmen is a Stolo scholar who's an associate professor in the School of Communication and one of the guiding figures of amongst our young colleagues in leading our school into the future. And I want to recognize that. And I want to acknowledge as well that Carmen has joined us and helped us to bring this panel together in the midst of being on leave, which is really hard. And it's a time that one steps away. And Carmen has remained with us, and we are grateful for that. So I want to acknowledge that. The present historical moment is hard, as we all know today. We feel this and know this, and sometimes it shapes how we see each other. We have also learned, and we are continuing to learn to say no to war, to injustice, to say not in our name, to resist the hardness around us, and instead to say yes to other worlds, to new realities and other visions of peace, democracy, reconciliation, justice, and equity. Tonight's panel will no doubt help to point in these directions. I think we all understand now that a series of cultural, economic, environmental, health, and political crises are threatening our ability to care for each other, to live together, to imagine a common democratic future. Many of these crises are not new, as our 50th anniversary celebration has helped to bring attention to and guide us in our thinking. They're the result of ongoing legacies of colonialism, imperialism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, racism, capitalism that persist across societies. Our panel this evening is part of both the school's 50th anniversary celebration and our collaboration with the Graham Spry Lecture Series, a role we've shared with the Université de Montréal for many years. The Spry Memorial Lecture has a long history of tackling key issues facing the media and its role in national public life. Similarly, over its 50-year history, SFU's School of Communication has sustained a rich and vibrant tradition of critical communication research, teaching, and engagement that aims to make visible and disrupt structures of power while contributing to the coordination and development of progressive social change. In this work, the process of critique has been taken up in a variety of ways to address the political economy, technologies, cultures, discourses, and institutional and normative structures and practices of communication that shape societies around the world. In respect of this history, we've taken up communication as critique as the central thematic guiding our celebration of the school's 50-year history. Critique is disruptive. It's clarifying, it's liberating, it is hopeful, and absolutely essential for making the kinds of collective, democratic, and diverse futures we need and are called upon to defend and struggle for. Over the past decade or so, the school has been revitalized by the addition of a group of brilliant new faculty members who have brought renewed energy, diversity, and necessary change to our ranks, including our leader tonight, Dr. Carmen Cray. We continue to be inspired and sometimes led by our remarkable students. While some of our colleagues have retired, leaving behind a legacy of an enviable scholarship, others continue on teaching, research, and community engagement that has helped to shape the field of communication in Canada and around the world. Over 50 years, our aims have often been to foment the kind of change that will make for a better world, especially for those who have long been excluded from opportunities and possibilities of a just and equitable future. It's in celebration of this rich and deep history that we've assembled a program to mark our 50th anniversary. In tonight's panel, we continue our celebration with presentations on creative practices, social movements, and policy change with Camilla Todd Fenwick McKelvey virtually, Liana Patrick, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carmen Cray, who will guide us through the rest of the evening. Carmen, thank you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Stuart. And thank you all for attending. It's great to see people. Yes, leave is great, but it is also great to make social contact every once in a while, and playing, Legend of Zelda for weeks at a time is not going to do it. So I'm very happy to be forcing myself to interact with real human beings, and I'm more than excited that these human beings are these people here with us today and online. So this is all by way of saying I feel very lucky to be moderating our panel for tonight. And I'm just echoing a little bit of what Stuart said, from my own positionality and experience of being at the school. The panel is, in working with the theme of fostering social justice, it is speaking to the school's long-held tradition of supporting work that is interested in fostering democracy, advocating for human rights, promoting activism that confronts and disrupts oppressive structures of power and the institutions through which they are often enacted, and that includes the university. So to this end, the school has been working very hard, as Stuart has said, and I think many will echo, that we've been working very hard to introduce, support, and foreground scholarship and perspectives that center marginalized voices as a part of this commitment to social justice. We have to redress the world that we see come through in the university should look like the world we travel through every day. And the school knows that and is working very hard to make that happen. Its commitment to producing in supporting these perspectives is working to support the production of new knowledge that can teach us how we can engage and transform these systems of power and the institutions through which they're enacted and often which end up constraining us. In my own work, I examine the history of Indigenous media in Canada. And the key observation that has come across to me is that when I'm talking to artists, interviewing artists, looking at their work, they are actively developing and articulating the kind of Indigenous critical theory that it's my job to understand. Because these are artists who are taking up these technologies, apparatuses, they're testing them and critiquing them in order to find ways to make them meaningful for Indigenous perspectives and priorities. So I look towards the people who create the work and often say the theories in the work because it's from the artists, from the creatives, that it's kind of it's not, it made me realize my job isn't to extract knowledge from them, but seek to, and then theorize around them as though they're historical phenomena. They're theorizing, and it's my job to listen and understand it. And those, I think we have these fantastic theorist practitioners here with us tonight. And so part of my job is to stop talking so that we can hear from these amazing perspectives. So with that, so I'm very happy to welcome our panelists, Kamala Todd, Dr. Fenwick McKelvey, and Dr. Liana Patrick, all of whom are approaching today's themes, and I think there's, of course, many inroads, and they're bringing different and invaluable perspectives shaped by their social positions and areas of expertise to enrich our understandings of the range of possible approaches to the work of challenging and transforming dominant systems towards our social justice goals. So in terms of how we're going to proceed tonight, we are going to start with Kamala, then we will switch to Fenwick, and then Liana will bring us home. Then we'll be followed by some discussion, open discussion, and which will welcome questions and comments from the audience, of course. So I'm just going to give, as each person comes up to speak, I'm just going to give a very brief bio by way of opening that up. But they, as you have seen from their wonderful bios online, their experience is vast, and it's very hard to try to condense that down to a sentence or two. But I will welcome Kamala Todd, Métis Cree mother, Indigenous planner, filmmaker, and educator, who has worked for several years with the City of Vancouver's Aboriginal Social Planner, and she was the city's first Indigenous arts and culture planner, as well as being a filmmaker and television producer. So please, Kamala.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Tansei, welcome, hello to everyone. Love being here. Also, don't get out much these days. I live on the Sunshine Coast, so it's always nice to be amongst people in person. Definitely grateful to be included, and I always consider it a major privilege to talk about my work and share my thoughts on things. So thank you for including me, and thank you to all of you for being here. And I always consider that when we are together and sharing and talking and reflecting, that we are in circle together. So it's always, I hope, a good and healing process and experience for all of us. So I'm just going to quickly give what I often call my story of place that I get my students. I work in urban studies. I teach one course in urban studies, and I get them to look at their story of place. So what is your story, your connection to these lands, or whichever lands you live on, and really reflecting on that, and really trying to help people remember that the city is land, because I think it's really easy to forget that. So myself, I was born and raised here in what's now known as Vancouver. I kind of grew up all over the lands of the Hunkaminam and Squamish-speaking people. And so I have this deep gratitude in particular to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, because all of my work and raising my kids and has been really centered on Vancouver. But these are not my lands. My mom, on her side, we come from Métis and Cree places such as St. Paul de Métis Settlement, Red River Métis Settlement, Lac La Biche, the BAC Band, places that I can kind of point to now, but that I really don't have a lot of connection to because I grew up here and because of those dislocations. My mother left Edmonton as a teenage runaway and came out here and had me out here, and so this is the only home I've ever known. My dad was born here. His parents were immigrants from Germany. And so, my story is very much about that dislocation. My grandfather spoke Cree. My mother, he didn't teach his children, so as a result, we don't speak Cree, though my mom tries really hard to get us all to learn. But so much of my life here and my work here is about learning what it means to live on someone else's land, away from your own lands, and what are my responsibilities? How do I practice reciprocity? How do I practice my cultural teachings and learn more and more of my cultural teachings in this place and in relationship to this place? So much of my work has really been, influenced by my mother, who is the filmmaker Loretta Todd, and the power of story, recognizing how much story can be used to disrupt, to challenge, to show truth, to speak truth, to show other ways, to show beauty, all of those things. And then I also, have this background in geography, in urban geography in particular, and that thing that I was taught about reading the city and reading the landscape. And so I guess I would say that I kind of work at the intersection, or I try to bring together film, but also kind of narrative, textual analysis or observation, as an urbanite, and planning, because I didn't really plan on going into planning, but it kind of happened. And in the end, I've kind of managed to make it my own unique way of approaching planning. But basically, growing up here, I will say that, thinking about the city and the stories that it tells and doesn't tell, so much of it is the colonial narrative. And I basically have read and, interpreted the dominant narrative of Vancouver for many years. And it's invariably the same story, that this was an empty land built by the Great White Fathers, who are the founders and caretakers of this place. And it's a proud narrative that is marked on the land, literally written on the land, or marked in the ways that we live here, in the landscape itself, in aesthetics, design. And it really reinforces this idea that certain people, in particular the white settler founders, have the authority and the power to shape this place, that they are the decision makers. And it's a very genocidal story because it's based on the eradication of the first people. It's based on this idea that there was nothing here before, and it doesn't, acknowledge or recognize the societies and their laws and their governance systems and their planning traditions and their economies and everything. This same narrative is in all the books, until very recently, but actually even the recent books too, that really celebrates this as a triumph, that celebrates this as improvement, as civilizing the land, from Milltown to metropolis. The brave fathers, the brave pioneers who carved a metropolis out of the wilderness. And that erasure, and that perpetuates that narrative, means that more and more the planners and decision makers and developers can continue to shape this place with the assumption that they have that authority, that they can write themselves onto the land, they can write their dreams onto the land, and also that they're not accountable to anything deeper. So it doesn't bring in or acknowledge the continuity, the ancient continuity of, in this case, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So, I see that all the time, and I get really frustrated. And while I was working at social planning, I said, we need to address this erasure, and we need to address this sense of invisibility that people are feeling. And so I pitched to my boss doing a project called Storyscapes. And so eventually he agreed. And so that kind of started my way of trying to do storytelling through planning. And so Storyscapes was oral history interviews with youth and elders, on video or audio, and then we also did a video project with residents from the downtown east side, with the idea that the more you change the narrative, the more that people's stories and histories and experiences are visible and heard, then that starts to kind of break away and chip away at that erasure and that colonial narrative. Storyscapes had a public art part to it, so I'd heard many times how hurtful it was that all of the totem poles and people go and see native culture at Stanley Park. It's like the most visited tourist site, but of course all the totem poles that were there were from other territories and were put there in contravention of local protocols and as a way of kind of further erasing the first people of these lands. So I was told like how hurtful that was, especially because people had villages there and were forcibly removed from their homes there. And so we were able to do a public art call, and it was the first Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh only public art call for that site, and that resulted in Susan Point's beautiful house post portals. And then just in general, I do documentary film. I've had the privilege of learning mostly from my mother. I don't consider myself like an art capital F filmmaker like she is, but I recognize the power of this form of storytelling, especially now, and again as another way to affirm and make really visible. In most of my work does relate to local people, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, sharing their stories, sharing their language, sharing their plant knowledge, sharing their teachings, and their, Larry Grant saying, "We have always been here." Just really trying to reiterate that every chance I get in the work that I do. I think it's, it can be really powerful. I take a lot of inspiration getting back to public art and kind of rewriting and writing the land, marking the land, reinscribing the people who are of these lands. Deborah Sparrow's vision, she's a weaver, she's an incredible artist of many forms, but she's always had this vision of making it really known that this is a land of blankets, and in particular the Coast Salish weavings that she was part of helping to revitalize. And so she's always had this vision of bringing them out. Here, I'm going to go full screen for this one, because of bringing them out onto the land and really making it known. And there's stories in these blankets, there's law, there's governance. They're so important to this place, to ceremony, to economy. And so the more that you see this, the more that hopefully that starts to disrupt the erasure and mark the land. And so I'm very inspired. And Deborah's work and other people's work like this is changing policy. So the culture plan I worked on in 2019, it was approved by council. We called it Culture Shift, Blanketing the City in Arts and Culture. We got Deborah's permission to use that subtitle with this idea of the visibility and voice of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh is a huge priority to address, that the city has been responsible for that erasure and has been responsible for perpetuating the violence of displacement and the erasure. So again, marking the land, the nations are working at returning their language to the land and making it visible. We did a naming of a park downtown, Sakulhenam or Sotsakwe, English is Rainbow Park. All these different ways that the nations have continuously tried to, remind people that this is their land. And it's really culminating in significant change. The city has started to pay attention to this. 2014, the city acknowledged that these are the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, which was a huge moment and a shift in now seeing them as sovereign nations, now seeing that the city needs to have a government-to-government relationship. Whereas when I started in 1999, the city didn't even know who the nations were, and they were like, well, that's reserve and that's federal. Why would we work with them? And not knowing whose lands the city is on. So it's resulted in last year, the Vancouver UNDRIP strategy was approved by council. And right now they're working on the action plan. It's coming out very soon. And this was a government-to-government process. And it's going, acknowledges the rights and title of the nations. It acknowledges the rights of urban Indigenous people as well, which is still being kind of worked out because it's a very different context. But it's going to change how the city does things. It's going to change how the city looks. And on that note, I'll just end by saying, I'm so inspired by the hard work and tenacity of people who are from these lands, who have had, urbanization, industrialization, do so much damage and do so much erasure and displacement. But here in Vancouver, the nations with their development corporation are transforming their lands and as they say, putting themselves back onto the land and taking their rightful place. And if you look at the Jericho Lands Ayalmoch project and the values and the principles and the teachings and the culture that are being woven into this mega project, to me, that's a vision of what it can look like to live in this city together, but to remember and learn and know whose lands these are and what that means for decision making for these lands, and what that means for who has the right to shape these lands, and that we all really need to listen and take direction from the people whose lands we're on. So yeah, I look forward to the conversation, and thank you. Hi.
Thank you so much, Kamala. So I'll move on to introduce Fenwick McKelvey, who is an associate professor in information and communication technology policy in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University. He studies digital politics and policy, appearing frequently as an expert commentator in the media, which I read a little bit today by way of prep, and intervening in media regulatory hearings. He is widely published. The list is online for all of you to read, but now we've got the chance to hear from him. So welcome, Dr. McKelvey.
Great. Okay. I just want to begin by saying thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I was so happy to be able to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the department, to also be part of the Spry Memorial Series, and to join such a prestigious panel. So I'm hoping I keep up my end. And again, apologies for the Wizard of Oz-like appearance I have in the room. I want to say that it is something to be quite thankful for, that we do have this ability of bringing together and working in hybrid spaces. And I think that there's been a long issue about inclusion and making sure that, given kind of barriers that I'm facing, we can still actually come together. And so I'm immensely thankful for the efforts to have me be able to participate still, given the, what's going on. And so I just want to apologize, my sincere apologies. I can't be there. Basically, health and family commitments have made my trip to Vancouver impossible. So I'm now coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, and I just want to acknowledge that the Ganaele Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters that I am now. And from there, my signal travels across many territories, across the railway lines built in efforts to settle Canada. And these routes, digital and physical, serve as a reminder of the histories I'd like to talk about tonight. And so for my opening remarks, I hope to follow up on some themes about changes, and particularly talking about what is really central for me to the field of Canadian communication studies. And I want to talk about the kind of legacies of that field, the legacies it has for me, and the consequences I think it has for scholarship, and ones to be mindful and aware of, and to think through in this kind of chance, and I think a very rare chance for me in reflection. So I'm really thankful to give this space. So I want to begin with a lithograph. And so this is a lithograph with a very short title, Meeting of the Officers of the Garrison of St. John in Fredericton on Long Island near present-day Hampstead, New Brunswick. I know this print very well because it's always hung in my grandparents' cottage for my whole life. So I grew up staring at this. Now, it serves as, I think, a reminder, because I was told that this print depicted the activities across the river, the Willistic River, or what I was taught, the St. John River on Long Island. And much like the lands where the cottage was built, this picture marks an erasure of the Maliseet people. And I have to thank Wolastoqey or Maliseet scholar Andrea Bayer Nicholas for teaching me that in her seminal article, The Role of Colonial Artists in the Dispossession and Displacement of the Maliseet. Nicholas writes, the man hauling a toboggan seen in the foreground illustrates not only the ongoing presence of the Maliseet on the lower St. John, but their importance to the survival of the soldiers and settlers. Although he occupies the foreground, and although winter survival for soldiers and settlers would have been completely impossible without the game provided by Maliseet hunters and the snowshoes, moccasins, and toboggans made by his people, the truth of his story is hidden amidst the tumult of the party. And that truth is a reminder of my own entanglements, active and past, with settler colonials. Not that my story is really anything of that much importance, but I think it's a helpful way to understand how my learnings with Canadian communication studies help me with this moment of teaching from Andrea Bear Nichols and this kind of moment of intersection, which I think is a possibility I'd like to hold throughout this talk. Now, I'm a little reluctant to admit it, but the Spry lecture, and I'm using Spry in both Graham Spry and Irene Spry, is like an incredible important foundation for me to the study of this place called Canada and the powers that we navigate every day. And I'd add their contemporary Ernest too, all part of this field that we call Canadian communication studies. And I'm inspired by comparative works in media studies by Sarah Sharma and Armand Town, and I'd like to keep an ambivalent reading of their work, not as homage, not in venerating them, but in thinking about the possibilities of what their approaches bring with and what they mean today for a study of what's taking place, as Stuart so eloquently describes at the start of this presentation. And so I'll begin first with Innes and then Graham Spry and Irene Spry to talk through, I think, some of these kind of legacies of Canadian communication studies. I begin by questioning this question of the imbrication of economy and democracy, as Innes did in his formative study, The Penetrative Power of the Price System. Part of that project for Innes involved the study of how the price system, what we now call British imperialism, rebuilt these lands. And indeed, in my home province of New Brunswick, you can largely see it as a post-industrial terrain, extensively logged and now trying to heal, where the forests are kind of second or third generation. But that project of extraction, that extractivism, is still active today. Down the river from all that logging, here's an oil refinery, basically in the town I grew up. And so I'd like to think about it. It's important to how we bring with us these histories as integral to our political cultures. And it's a challenge to political activism today. Now, focusing on what my colleagues have called petrocultures, I think is central to understanding present debates about polarization and disinformation. So we have, I think, constant concern about kind of the consequences of social media. But here, I think, in keeping with Canadian communication studies, we can start to understand how our politics are informed by economics and how we find ourselves caught up in these price systems of everyday life. And here's a poignant moment for me during the Freedom Convoy when a local resident stood up to a truck. And so you can see in the picture, and this is a video that was shared on TikTok, the protester was, the resident was actually holding up a cell phone blocking the movement of the truck. Now, on one hand, the big rig and the open road, concepts so deeply tied to lived senses of political freedom. And on the other, we have a cell phone pointed at the truck, part of, I think, a different form of freedom, one associated with the freedom to move online. And if we try to think about the penetrative power of the price system, we are looking at this picture and we're looking at not only a kind of conflict of politics, but a conflict of two different ways of thinking about technologies and freedom. One, petroleum, and the other, one more about digital technology. And looking at how our political conflicts are shaped by these kind of forces of the price systems and theories of intersections of technology and political freedom. Now, neither I would add is particularly sustainable. But in situating these politics, we can begin to understand what forces shape the political desires taking place in Canada as productive desires, like the open road or a belief for political data that animate our present politics today. Now, I began with a critical point, but I also want to raise a second legacy of communication studies, and that is of policy activism. And that hopefully is something we can continue in our discussion. I look forward to that. The Sprys themselves, for me, serve as a reminder that the field of communication studies has always involved policy activism. From the Radio League to today, part of what communication studies has tried to advance is a critical intervention in the governance of media. And I think that's a very unique scholarly tradition, and one that I try to hold when I talk or identify as a Canadian policy scholar. And when I was trying to find an example or think about an example of what does that actually mean in practice, I was struck because this is one of a couple open letters that are circulating calling for urgent reforms to the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. I think this is quite a present moment of technology and media activism right now because the bill's before the House. And it's led by civil society, including groups, including Open Media based in Vancouver. And I was struck by the individual signatories you can see in the bottom right, where so many of the names that have signed this come from communication studies. And I think it's a small point, but I think it's a reminder that we have and have succeeded in part in our field in keeping and maintaining, in some small part, a decade-long commitment to media activism, and perhaps in some way towards public interest activism. But I think now, and this is what I'd like to close on, is that part of what we talk about when we talk about the public interest, I feel like is a point of critical reflection now. What did the field take for granted when claiming to speak for the public interest? That to me seems, I think, part of what we need to unsettle in moving and advancing the field, and trying to reflect on and rebuild theories of the public interest that acknowledge our past and shared visions. And what kind of political freedoms did this usage of the public interest take for granted? And which returns me to Irene Spry, which in her own work talks about the studies of the Commons and the consequences of the displacement of members of the Blackfoot Confederacy from the plains. And I actually think that if we're trying to unsettle this public interest, one concept I'd like to return to and develop again is this idea of the commons, not just as a way of life that's past, but as also as acknowledgement of the political possibilities of these common histories above, and a way to reimagine the commons as a shared political project. And to give a concrete example, I actually see the commons as central to the next struggles in media activism against a particular political economy of artificial intelligence. What is ChatGPT but not a reflection of our shared cultural commons, compressed and connected through these new interfaces? And I think returning to that image of Long Island, no doubt part of another training set, we have to remember how these histories have drawn us together and to begin to question what are the possible relations we desire to have. And so that's where I think, at least for me, this is the beginnings or the possibilities that Canadian communication studies affords. And it's one that I hope we can continue to discuss and think about what does this field mean, and particularly mean for the activism we've been describing on this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fenwick. And our last speaker today is Dr. Liana Patrick. She's from the Stalatin First Nation and is Acadian Scottish as well. She's worked in communications and education for over 2 decades. She was education coordinator in the Faculty of Medicine at UBC, where she worked on curriculum development, managed education programs, and promoted knowledge translation of Indigenous research findings to healthcare providers and health science students. Again, just a laundry list of amazing accomplishments. But Liana is currently assistant professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences, where her work focuses on the intersection of Indigenous health, planning, and justice. She incorporates film and other multimedia in her work and is committed to public scholarship as a creative and collaborative process of exploration with Indigenous communities. Welcome, Liana.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I have no slides. I apologize. You've got lovely pictures to look at. I just want to start off by saying that I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak here today from Stuart, from Carmen, and thrilled to be speaking alongside these brilliant people. In the few minutes that I have, I just wanted to briefly talk a bit about my own interdisciplinary background, and I think that gives some insight into how I, have engaged in the work that I do, and talk a little bit about my current focus, which really brings together a lot of the different pieces that I've worked on over the last number of years. So I've been involved in a lot of work that is connected to social movements and creative practices, both as a participant in those movements, but also in documenting efforts to create pathways through systems of oppression. And I actually started off wanting to be a journalist. And I wanted to be a journalist from the time I was very young, from the time I was about 8 or 9. And I had this deep curiosity, and I was obsessed with the news. And what I noticed was that I didn't understand. I mean, aside from the fact that I was 9 years old, it was it was so confusing to me what was happening in these images I was seeing, and in particular, these images from other parts of the world. Some of the same images we're continuing to see today. This is like the early 80s. And what I realized was that I had such a curiosity to know why I was seeing what I was seeing. It was so decontextualized, this kind of mainstream media that I was seeing. And so I moved into this space in my undergrad, where I was in creative writing and history, which seemed to be a good complementary approach, because I also really needed to better understand the history and contemporary experiences of my own people, which I didn't always have access to growing up, even though I come from a family that has these deep connections, cultural connections to the land, and my father was very much involved in the politics of our nation and our community as the co-founder of our tribal council. But growing up at that time in the 80s and coming into my learning path in the 90s, there weren't courses you could really take. You kind of had to like piece things together and sort of figure it out for yourself. And so part of that work, what I really realized I had to do after a stint working in communications in government, was that I really needed to actually not be on the government side of the table. I needed to be on, because I worked in treaty negotiations, but I really needed to better understand what this history was. And so from there, I did a master's in Indigenous governance. And through the process of doing that work and through my own personal lived experience of health and seeing some of the struggles in my own family and in my community, I started connecting up these different pieces. I started really seeing how our experiences of health, both collectively and individually, was intimately connected to ongoing violence, ongoing colonial violence. And I really wanted to bring all of these things together. And so that, was the impetus for moving into health research. And I think the common thread through all of this was really the power of story, to center Indigenous voices in these stories. And so the ways in which I've engaged in this work, is really connecting to different arts-based practices, different creative practices, and that includes music and film and visual arts. Through the course of my doctoral dissertation work, I ended up creating an art exhibit that was a number of photographs and different interpretations, and it was based on the contents of a suitcase that I had inherited from my grandma, who called Grandma Alu. And these contents really tell the story of her life and tell the story of from the 1940s up until she passed in the early 2000s, because it was all of her beading materials and all of the materials that she used for her arts practice. And she didn't read or write, and so she would just take whatever paper was around or whatever box, and she would use that as a cutout for a glove or a moccasin. And when I flipped it over, I saw that there was different things. There was an old tea box. There was an old exercise book of my dad's from residential school. And when I saw that, I was just completely floored, because this was the only connection other than my dad's stories that we had. It was this archive. And I realized that was my inheritance. And it was this rich, incredible story. And so through this art exhibit, I was able to bring together all of these different folks who we could talk about what historical memory meant for each of us, and to really embed actually a lot of the work that I was doing in my PhD, which was in community planning and looking at community practices. I've also incorporated a lot of film into my work, and I have this kind of long and winding history through film as well. When I was doing my creative writing degree, I ended up working as an intern on a TV show called North of 60, which is going to date myself. Some of you may know this show. It was pretty popular back in the 90s. And I just, I really, I loved that work, and I loved the storytelling. I was in the story department, and I knew that I didn't really think I was going to pursue a mainstream career in it, but I knew that I would always do more of a community-centered, community-built approach. And so I also wrote about film in my master's degree. So I always felt like I would more theorize, as you were mentioning about. And I love what you said about the idea that it really resides in the work. And it's up to us to kind of talk about these things. And I was documenting in my master's different ways that the community I was working with were telling these stories. Some of them were, folks were making films that were meant only for the community and for very specific purposes. And others were making them for public uses. So it was really about thinking about film in the fourth world and what that actually meant at that time, kind of the early 2000s. But I've also used it as a teaching tool in my work. I helped to create these videos in the Faculty of Medicine that were teaching tools, and I think that there are so many different ways that the power of story can emerge in these different kinds of practices. So in terms of the current work that I'm doing, I'm bringing together a lot of the things that I've studied, the work that I've been engaged in, and in part, this has really resulted in a shift of perspective and a shift of approach. So up to now, a lot of my research and work has really focused on bringing together community planning and health and justice. And it's really shifted because of the communities that I've worked with and where I've been directed to kind of put my attention to the intersection of climate crises and community health, and efforts to reclaim stewardship of lands and waters. So I am working on a feature-length documentary that is documenting individual actions that really connect to larger community efforts. So the film is about the Nechako River and how communities in my nation are asserting stewardship of lands and waters in the wake of a loss of the river. It was dammed in the 1950s, and 70% of it was diverted for Alcan, now Rio Tinto Alcan. And that river really formed the basis of our culture. So in documenting, what I'm doing is I'm actually documenting the daily practices of individuals and groups within our nations that are really part of efforts to assert self-determination and, importantly, to assert guardianship, to reassert guardianship of our waters specifically, but also our lands. And I really look at what they're doing as the practices that are going to contribute to all of us addressing climate crises. So I document them alongside the more visible, high-profile efforts of our communities, including court cases and occupation of homelands. And so I'm really kind of connecting these intimate practices, these intimate spaces with larger community efforts to reassert our place on the land and to make visible what we've always done, what we've done since the time of contact, which is to adapt and change and continue to caretake our lands and waters. So I think the quieter, more intimate stories are really the ones that can have a great impact on people, and so they're the stories I've always been drawn to. And I think that this is also intimately connected to policy change, but I think more importantly, it's connected to political change, because it's really a lot of the work that I've tried to do is to disrupt the idea that we did not have knowledge, that we did not have power, that we did not have authority, and pass that on to our children and the other generation. So I really do see these kinds of projects as disrupting those kinds of ideas and connecting people in different ways. That also, I think, speaks to the need that we have to find models for coexistence while also centering those Indigenous voices. So, masicho for listening, and I really look forward to discussion and conversation. Masi.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing, clearly a remarkably broad scope of work and thought and interdisciplinarity, and that comprises your work. I'm going to go ahead and just ask a question, give you each an opportunity to answer, and then I want to make sure that I keep some time for any questions or comments in the audience. So I realize everybody's coming from very diverse positions, perspectives, and work. But it also very much is very clear that everybody here is engaging with policy, law, certain kinds of established systems and structures as a part of your work. And I think, one of the terms we've been talking about and kind of framing this panel with has to do with intervention, disruption, and this consistent kind of engagement with these apparatuses, which are often state apparatuses or apparatuses that are a part of a colonial continuity that enfold Indigenous people, that enfold marginalized groups, that affect the engagement or and communication with publics with a vested interest and who really bear the consequences of these practices and apparatuses. And Fenwick, I think you brought up the term ambivalent, which I think was very helpful in framing these forms of engagement and why we choose to do that. So really my broad question here is, can you talk more about the role or value of working with these apparatuses for seeking social justice, for supporting marginalized groups, and in a sense, why do we do it? And what, in your experience, kind of undergirds or drives those points of connection for you?
I always love to share this one story. When I was actively at the city and we were doing storyscapes, part of my job was to meet with community groups, and one of them was the Aboriginal Front Door in downtown East Side. And that was at the time in the early 2000s when there was so much planning and hand-wringing about what are we going to do with the downtown East Side and all this money and all this stuff going on. And Indigenous organizations were sort of being engaged in some degree, and there were some tables where people were going to, but the grassroots residents, who would go to the Aboriginal Front Door, so your elders, your everyday person who lived in the neighborhood, really wasn't included in that work. So I'd go and meet with them, and then I heard, and I was talking to them, do you want to do a video project as part of the Storyscapes project? It can be whatever, is an important story for you. And I heard from people, this frustration that the planning process for the downtown East Side was just with service providers and just with kind of established people. And I'd say, okay, well, I work with the downtown East Side planner, Nathan Edelson, may he rest in peace, who was doing incredible work and was very open. And I just said, I can bring him down to meet with you and hear from you and, directly connect you with the planner. He needs to connect with you. And they said, well, right now we just want to work on this video project with you because that's how we're going to get our voice out there. And they really felt that was the best way to be heard. And that will always stick with me. And on that note too, Nathan Edelson, who was this incredible, open, radical planner, he was so transformed when he heard these stories that we were gathering about Gastown. He didn't know about the Great Fire and Squamish people rescuing settlers from the Great Fire. He didn't know about Gassy Jack being married to Squamish women. All these stories that were coming out, and he would say, okay, we need to tell these stories, and it changed how he looked at the neighborhood. and how he understood how planning should happen. And I know that, that's a lot of other people's work, is thinking about stories as data and how important that is. But the other story I'll really quickly say is my mom and Leonard George were really close in that kind of 80s activism days, and they would talk about all the forms of oppression for Indigenous people, church, state, education system, and media. And it was at that moment where both of them, Leonard George was in politics and media, but my mom knew that's what she wanted to address, was the media as a form of oppression. And, as an artist, she can take that path, but it's also really, impactful. So that's my response. Thank you.
What came to my mind when you asked the question, which is a really great question, was particularly, I'll talk about film and video. And I have been interested in this for a few decades now. And I really had a lot of hope in the late 90s, early 2000s, about what appeared to me and many others to be the democratization of the tools of storytelling, and that it was becoming less exclusive. It was becoming more widely available. It was becoming just accessible for many folks. And this was really exciting to me. And this is before social media. This is before all of these, that you can make a movie on your iPhone. But I just thought I think this actually does portend some interest, some really promising pathways for shifting power. And so that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I really loved that when I was doing my master's, I had actually wanted to make a film with Tla'amin Nation, who I was partnering with. And by the time I got the guts up to actually do it, they had already made 2 films. So I thought, well, I'm not going to try to make a third. I'm going to talk to the folks who made them about the process that they used. And it was so insightful and just very inspiring still to this day to think about it. And so I think there are so many, as you would well know, Carmen, there are so many issues with the dominant, the film festival, culture of film festivals, and how you kind of break into these spaces and what's required, and how really actually difficult and exclusive it can all be. But I think that there's also this really powerful work that's happening. It's just like a tidal wave, and we're standing on the shoulders of Barry Barkley and all these amazing people, Alani Subamswin, but people who were doing this work and have been doing this work for many years and paving this path for Indigenous creatives and filmmakers to really push and I'll just share the example. I'm just so proud of the team that I work with on the film on Inchaco. I'm working with Lantern Films and Experimental Forest Films, and they really, and the National Film Board is a co-producer, and they really wanted to push back against some of the contract language in the NFB, and it didn't even occur to me that we actually could fight this and have different language. And so we actually are the first production to have a recognition in our co-production agreement of Indigenous screen sovereignty. And I thought, those are the kinds of spaces that I think are really going to change those things. So there's interfacing with these kinds of systems and structures that can be deeply problematic. And then there's creating these shifts within those structures that I think opens up some different possibilities. And so I guess I have hope in that way that that we can, as problematic as it can be, that it can result and be productive of something that actually is affirming of our right and responsibility in terms of self-determining and telling our own stories. And there's also the ownership piece, which is another piece I think that's important.
Thanks, Diana. Fenwick, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I can just jump in briefly. I think, for me, I feel like I'm coming from, very different, I mean, obviously, a different point of intervention. I think a lot of my work has been at the federal level, at the CRTC, and in the kind of media governance space. And I think part of that was an acknowledgement of like diversity of tactics and being someone who had the privilege of being in those rooms that were arguably designed for someone like me to be in. And so how does that become or could become a site of critical practice and scholarship? And I think that's was something that always at least was the kind of driving motivation. I think now for me, I'm at a real point of ambivalence where I'm, had been trying to work at and bring at least counterpoints to many of these spaces when we're talking, whether it's about access to internet or broadband or, corporate power in Canada. At the time, it felt like there was a moment of intervening. And I think as of doing this more, I feel I have more doubts now. And I doubt whether what we're doing or what I'm doing is enabling or trying to like bring about counterpoints or try to push at against these systems, or is it more legitimating a system of power that's moving on regardless of what's going on? I think that to me is something which is really present in where I'm talking from right now. Is that I don't know. I don't know what the benefit in many ways with the policy work doing now is, that it seems as though it just perpetuates or allows or legitimates a much more problematic process. And I think that's an uncertainty I'm really living with. And I say this, and I also just want to conclude or just close that I think one of the things that's really telling for me is in dealing with or working with like my own students, it feels as though their own sense of making change or understanding how to make change is lost, or they don't get it. And so I also want to just acknowledge that in some ways talking about different forms of trying to work at or work against the system maybe as a pedagogy is part of the importance now, less about whether you're making change at that system, where you're actually teaching that there's a possibility of doing this, at least at the policy level.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that question of ambivalence, and I think the fundamental question of, are we challenging or are we, in a sense, facilitating a kind of way of legitimizing the ongoing existence of a structure that maybe doesn't need to exist anymore, or needs to undergo a more profound transformation, or die on the vine. But I think this is something we ultimately end up wrestling with, particularly, it's a fundamental question of that many oppressed groups and perspectives have to struggle with. To what extent do you engage with these structures of dominance? And then the question is also, then what else? So we also explore those questions as well. I realize, though, I think we have another 10 minutes, and so I did want to see if anybody had any questions or comments in the audience. I see one hand here, and then...
Yeah, I guess my question was mostly to the two of you. You guys have been talking a lot about the sort of interventionary aspect of your work and interacting with these, especially like state apparatus, that in the way they approach story and knowledge are these very like dry, bureaucratizing notions. And both of you have a background in specifically like the artistry of storytelling and of making art of storytelling. And I think one point that I was particularly interested is, where does this practice of like artistry in relation to community knowledge and into community storytelling kind of inflect itself upon the way that you guys approach social justice work?
Thank you. It's a great question. Just earlier this afternoon, I was with some of my research partners, we have a project in Surrey where we're doing a canoe journey, and we're bringing together health and social service providers with community members to go on this canoe journey, and we're going to document it by video. And we have a cultural coordinator from one of the land-based nations, and she was saying, so our elders and our people want to know, like, who's going to see this? Why are you doing this? What's it for? You know, all these really excellent questions. And I was like, yes, absolutely. Like, let's talk about this. I'll write something down. Do you want me to meet with people, figure it out? But as we were talking through it, you know, I was mentioning how for myself, it's like process is everything. Like the production is a piece of it, but here's process and here's production. It's like, so, for example, built into Ganaele, the feature length, we were in development for 3 years on it, in part because of COVID, but in part because we had to really do that like intensive work with the communities to, because it's community-led and community-driven, so we needed to, you know, see how they wanted to proceed, to make sure that there was, you know, interest and the desire to actually make this film, and what that might look like. And coming out of that, we have, you know, a memorandum of understanding with the nations. We have they will eventually own the film, but we also have a mentorship apprenticeship program. We also have an archiving program that we are developing as part of this film. So. And that, to me, is like really responding to issues of justice, because this is not, it's not generally the process of mainstream storytelling. And so even, I'll give a quick example. I think it's okay to share this. I'm on a board of a nonprofit, and a big pharma company, a well-known big pharma company involved in weight loss things, approached us about doing a film, and they were like, oh, you'll be totally involved in the film. You'll get to like see all the scripts, and we'll meet with you, and it'll be great. And I'm like, okay, and what else is there? So it's like, there's a sense that like with these kinds of projects that it's just like, it's enough, like that we're gonna do this for you. You're gonna get so much exposure, and we're gonna make a beautiful film about your wonderful nonprofit. And they will benefit tremendously. And how are we gonna benefit from this association? So to my mind, I hope I'm somewhere close to answering the question, but I feel like it's really pushing back and challenging those kinds of, because it's like, it's constant. Yeah, it happens a lot, and it can be, you just have to figure out your strategies.
I mean, yeah, if I want to think of my context of bureaucracy, like city government and shifts that I've seen there, definitely see arts and cultures together, and culture in kind of cultural ways and ways of being, so not necessarily seeing myself as an artist in that way. The whole thing of like the Storyscapes project that I shared, you know, my boss was saying, I keep hearing from Indigenous residents that they feel invisible. And I was like, yeah, exactly. So that's why storytelling, because when I would pitch it to him, he'd be like, well, we don't really do that. You know, we're social planning, or social policy as it's now called. But I kept saying, like, this is how you address that sense of invisibility that people have, is in this way. And then people can do it in their self-determined ways and in the ways that works for the community. So that was a shift, is seeing that as something that you do within the city itself. And then I think of things like, I learned from leaders, you know, who enter those spaces, who enter those very colonial, very bureaucratic spaces and do things in their own way, which maybe in the past was not as safe, and, you know, people were still kind of come out of a lot of, you know, heavy oppression. But I think of somebody like Chrissy Lee Charles. She's from Musqueam. She's like a leader in so many ways. She's also a hip hop artist and an artist in so many ways. And she enters those spaces and she'll sing a song, or, you know, she'll do a hip hop song, or she'll sing her Musqueam songs. She'll speak in her language. She raps in her language, and just the disruption of that, and reminding people like, and I now, then that gives me courage. So I'll go to meetings and say, the city is a made-up system. The law is a made-up law. And like, it shocks people because but then each time you say it, then it becomes more and more normalized, and it helps people kind of like challenge their assumptions and challenge what's been normalized for them. So having someone like, and then we did a language proclamation, and Larry Grant and Gabriel George, Hunkaminam speakers, unfortunately a Squamish speaker couldn't be there, but they went right into the center of council chambers, and they sang and they spoke in their language, and it was like just that little moment, and I was even like, can we do that? Can we please, and but like, of course, and kind of just all those little ways of pushing it back and helping the powers that be see that they are not all that, and that they actually need to be humble and in deference to the people of these lands. So I see it has a lot of impact that way, and people are bringing, before the UNDRIP strategy, the nations wanted to do their own ceremony where they basically said, no, we give you the strategy, City of Vancouver, and then also in the council chambers, they also did their own protocols and their own songs and their own, ways. So those things can be very transformative.
As I'm walking over to Vivian, I just want to note that I thought it was so fascinating how each of the three presentations to start us off with had thoughts and contributions around the larger theme of governance. And I was thinking, Liana, of a conversation we had some time ago about alternative forms of art and sovereignty and the way these kinds of languages knit together. And I just thought, I wanted to just note that as a theme that arose in all three presentations about how this kind of work registers questions of governance in a way that we don't think and with tools we often don't imagine. And I just wanted to name that as a fascinating theme that came up. Vivian?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a few questions about sovereignty. And it's come to my attention that BC is the only province where there are not treaties between the Crown and First Nations. So all the other provinces where they're First Nations, they have control over their land, culture, power, etc. And so I'm just wondering from your point of view, do you think that if you had treaties and more power and control, that it would change cultural practices?
So, well, I mean, first of all, there were some treaties in BC. So there's the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island and in the Northeast Treaty 8. And we have modern day treaties. We have a treaty with the Niska Nation, and we also have 3 or 4, including Flaam and the nation that I was at the treaty table with when I started, when I worked in government. So I mean, I would just say that it creates different kinds of conditions. And in a way, it's been a really interesting opportunity for the nations in BC to kind of to disrupt and to engage in different kinds of actions because we don't have a treaty relationship with the government. And so I think it's, it's obviously like a really big question in terms of if we had treaties, what would that mean? Because we've attempted to engage in treaty negotiations, but the various levels of government have very different approaches and ideas about what that looks like in terms of self-determination for, in being in a relationship. And it's not to disparage nations who have been in those, relationships. It's just different.
I guess the one thing I will say is that, and I'm not from a BC First Nation, so I can't speak to that specifically, but only to know that I've been inspired by the local nations in that sense of, I think with a lot of people think, oh, with treaty, you just kind of get your little parcel of land and then you lose the rest. So the reminder that it is and always will be their territory, no matter how, even if your reserve is this tiny little piece. And just that reminder, and that's why the City of Vancouver didn't know and didn't care whose lands they were on, because they thought, oh, well, that's their First Nations are over there. We're the City of Vancouver, and like, oh, well, what happened? Did you think about these lands and whose they are? So part of it is that mindset, and even though the local nations are in various stages of their own work with treaty, it's that reminder that Aboriginal title goes deeper, and Aboriginal title is forever and can't be extinguished, can't be parceled up, no matter what your treaties say. Even people who are ceded, they're not ceded. It's always going to be their land. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, and I think the local nations really help show that it doesn't even matter what stage they're at. It's that their territory has always and always will be their territory, and then the rest of us can learn what that means and respect that. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this panel a lot. My question is picking up on many responses that you gave to the first question, where we started to sort of talk about institutions and how we relate to them. And my question is more specifically around, like, how do you think about your role as somebody sort of navigating potentially between Indigenous folks who you're trying to support and institutions like you might be working for, like the city or a university, and like how do you bring in questions about care and knowledge and protecting people and that kind of thing? And I'm asking the question, you know, from the perspective that there's lots of students in the room and faculty like myself who work in and navigate institutions in our own context of the communities we work with. So just asking from the perspective that you seem to have a ton of knowledge about this topic. Thank you.
I guess the distinction is often, I mean, I don't know if you mean community or people who are staff within those institutions or both, yeah. I have less experience with community, and there it's like listening to the leaders, listening to the elders, like, you know, listening to staff who are there. The one thing I think all I can offer at this moment is, well, cultural safety, of course, is a huge thing right now, and that people are finally starting to recognize is, you know, essential and needed in all of these spaces. But that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, Indigenous people who are in these roles, it's their job, and it's also like personally embodied, like it's everything, right? So it's not just a job, and how different that is, you know, to be someone in a system who talks about justice, who might kind of theorize about things, and then somebody who actually like is living it, and that goes for other communities too, of course. And what does that mean, and what kinds of supports are needed for that? And so that, again, luckily, you know, through advocating, I definitely saw at the city that, you know, sometimes people would organize ourselves and kind of like different groups where we would get together and support each other. And then gradually, like with the lovely AFTAB coming in for a while, you know, she was able to create like an elders in residence program for staff and support all kinds of ways for keeping people going. But yeah, it's a huge question, and definitely in the health system and SFU, you'd have more to share.
Yeah, it's also what I teach to my students as well. And think I'm like, oh, how do I talk? And I can talk about it through the teaching that I do, which builds on my own experience working in lots of different research, community-based and community-engaged research projects. And I think probably one of the most important things is to, so we're really constrained institutionally. You have like, you know, financial constraints, you have time constraints, you have what can you spend money on constraints, what does ethics allow you to do constraints. So lots of people, again, have done lots of good work to start to like challenge those systems. So I think it's about providing a bit of a buffer, and you know, this is a challenging thing for Indigenous faculty because we often have to do like a bunch of different labor on this, but at the same time, it's like this is the responsibility that I've accepted in this role. And so you have to, I think, sometimes push back against different things. And I feel like the system like kind of shifts a little bit and kind of responds and kind of doesn't. But that time factor, making sure that there's like a lot of time to do that work so that people are not having to operate on institutional timelines, again, which is a big challenge. Capacity and resources, having somebody who can sort of be, I'm trying to think of the word for it, and it's like kind of escaping me. I said interlocutor, that word earlier, and I'm like, it's kind of like an interlocutor, somebody who can like be like a go-between, so that the community is not always being asked to like do, the work and respond. And so I think, just in terms of like protecting the community, like I really do see my role as shifting resources from, Tri-Council or university into communities that they can do the work that they want to do and that they need to do. So it's really being like responsive to what those needs are, and it's hard work. I mean, like I mentioned, it's the development time for the film was years, and sometimes you're just working with one community and you're expected in the university to do like multiple and many things, but when you do that, then you're taking away from other relationships that you have. So it's just, I think, being really clear with what your priorities are and your values. And I always ask students, like, why do you want to do the work that you're doing? And have really strong relationships with those communities that you're working with. So a lot of, people come from the communities, or if they don't, then it's like just you need to spend time. I never cold call. I don't cold call people, but I build on, and that's why I've been fortunate, I think, in a lot of the projects I've worked on, I've really built on existing relationships or ones that I've been brought into, and it just, it takes time. So. And there's the ongoing tension that everybody will always have to manage between the energy that we put towards these institutions and the energy we put towards building something new or like focusing on building up existing Indigenous governance structures or whatever it is. I think there's just this tension that we navigate between those two things.
Yeah, I was just going to check in with Fenwick, and I guess on the question of working between institutions, communities, or interest groups, I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts or any final thoughts while we're heading towards the end.
Yeah, I just certainly, I leave it to the panelists to talk about the specific context of this. I would say that, one of the parts that's, I think, really important just to remember is that these institutions have succeeded in offered victories. I think part of the foundations for me, at least in getting into Canadian media policy, has been following KNET, which is the Indigenous Internet service provider in Northern Ontario. And part of that was through successfully navigating these systems to build out and carve out community space and resources. So I think that part of that struggle is just to also remember the kind of success, and I think some of the success in Indigenous media activism in Canada and really delivering some of these wins. And I think that that's part of what is the tension at work here, is there opportunities to be had in working within these systems? I think that's, as I've said, one of the ones that stays with me as a challenge, and certainly well aware that the type of way that you're talking about, or at least I'm talking about, justice is very different from that lived experience, and that even at the best of times, university is a difficult place to work. And so I think that's also a growing concern, is like the space and the capabilities of having the university as a critical voice that's trying to ensure that there's space and time to do this type of work. And that's, I think, something that's important to remember and hold today and to keep going tomorrow with.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we're kind of all in that. I think it's a productive ambivalence, because it's a question we should always be asking. And I really appreciate also Kate and Liana and Kamala, reminding us that, think about where we are putting our energy and resources. Who are we focusing on as our priority? And that there are communities and groups of people and the relationships that we have or want to have with them and want to nurture and grow are really a priority. And just in a way to kind of bracket the question of to what extent, what is the role of the institution in emancipatory politics? Well, probably not a lot, but, genuinely, they've stuck around for a long time for a reason. And We could be beating our heads against a wall at certain points, or we could find productive sites of intervention, but at the same time, we have to take stock of what our priority is. And I think one of the threads that's been running through is thinking with care and thoughtfulness and deliberateness about how we build those relationships as being one of the most important things. And I really appreciated your observations about, when you were saying process is this and the actual thing is this. It's absolutely true. We talk about this all the time, certainly in doing Indigenous research, is that we are not a deliverables-oriented way of thinking. We are process is the product, I guess is the shorthand for that. The point is to make sure the process works, not to write a deliverable on the grant as the actual goal of what you're doing. The work is going to challenge the timeline of the institution. It's going to try people's patience. It's going to scare some people who have certain institutional pressures, say, coming down on them administratively to produce, with that orientation. So I'm so appreciative of your work, holding the space to say, slow down and pay attention to these things, because you could construct something tokenistic and say that this is reconciliation or this is meaningful representation, and compound an alienation that already exists and a tension between, say, Indigenous communities and universities that has always been there. Or you can transform that relationship and hold the space and just say, you just have to hold on. Like, this is not going to work according to your timelines and your priorities. You have to start paying attention to ours as a part of your obligation because of where you stand. Because of where we live and work, and our obligation to understanding that we all have an obligation to that history because we are a product of it. We're all here because we are a product of colonial history and the peoples whose resources and lives have been mined in order for us to be here. So I think that is to my mind, the logic for one of the biggest challenges, which is to gain enough of a critical mass to slow the train down and create the space to, in a sense, acknowledge and make the process the priority and ultimately the product, for lack of a better word. So I think that was, a really strong thread. It runs through my work. It's running through people's comments, and I just wanted to reflect on that as we're wrapping up before turning it over to Stuart.
Wow, thank you, Carmen. That was a fantastic roundup. I'm so grateful to you, to Liana, to Camilla, to Fenwick for what you've shared with us. I'm going to walk away, as I'm sure many in the room are, with a number, as you've so nicely put together, Carmen, a number of layers of thought. I'm really taken as well by not only the question of governance which comes about, but by the way in which you describe the work of alternative media. And I just want to note that whether it was Liana sharing with us that making film is not only making a product, but in fact building an infrastructure often that's left behind in communities. That's part of what it means to actually create a full register of meaning and resource. And when Camilla was sharing with us about the genres of communication that are used in policy interventions and the way in which art and music inform and disrupt and reset that table, as it were, I thought that was a powerful way of understanding how creative practice disrupts and reorients. And when Fenwick left us with the idea, in fact, that in the midst of struggles to intervene and the desire to build future actors, the need to have a pedagogy of intervention and to work on the training and working with young people as the future of possible building out of a creative mass, as you said, Carmen, to end us on, strikes me as a powerful linking together of what these kinds of alternative intervention strategies and acts demand of us today. And so I just want to thank you all for what you've shared with us and allowed us to continue in our celebration of this week fostering social justice as an aspect of communication, as critique that's part of our school. And I'm really grateful to what you've shared with us. Thank you to all of you who have been with us for the evening. It's great. We are going to have, as a follow-up to tonight's event, we have an alumni celebration next Friday here at Harbor Center. And I want to make note of our final keynote event on November 16th with Sarah Benet-Weiser, who's a fantastic scholar that many of you will know, and we invite you to come on back for that celebration as well. Thanks, everybody, and have a great night.